They told me my voice was cursed. They told me no one would ever want me. But when I sang, the Alpha Sovereign stood, and the whole world went silent. The feast hall had been roaring a moment ago. Now every gaze was locked on me. His eyes, silver storms, pinned me in place. And then he spoke one word that changed everything. Mine. Lyria was 19 years old, a quiet shadow among the restless bodies of the Silver Fang pack. A presence so small that many forgot she existed until they needed something scrubbed, fetched, or carried. She bore the title of Omega, the lowest rank, not because she lacked strength or cunning, but because life had dealt her a hand so cruel it had stolen more than her standing. It had stolen her voice, or rather, her willingness to use it. Silence was her armour, a shield forged in years of whispered threats and punishments that taught her words could be sharpened into weapons, and sometimes it was safer to carry none. In the thin light of dawn, she could be found trudging along the packed earth path between the well and the kitchens, the wooden buckets hanging from her hands so heavy that the ropes bit into her palms, leaving red grooves that lingered long after the water had been poured. She knew every creak of the old stable doors, every knot in the warped floorboards, every corner where straw collected, damp with the scent of hay and the musk of horses. Her cot was wedged into a narrow space between the feed storage and the outer wall, where the wind sneaked through unseen cracks to nip at her toes on winter nights, and she would curl tightly beneath her threadbare blanket, listening to the faint echo of laughter from the main house, laughter that never belonged to her. In the market square, where the scents of fresh bread and roasting meat tangled with the smoke of burning pine, she moved with her chin tucked and her gaze lowered, knowing too well the sting of eyes that did not look at her with kindness. Sometimes the looks were pitying, but more often they carried a glint of mockery, the kind that made her stomach tighten. "Mute little Omega, useless little thing," they would murmur just loud enough for her to hear, and though she never let them see her flinch, the words lodged themselves in her chest like splinters she could not pull free. She had learned that people liked her best when she took up no space, when she passed by like a wisp of smoke, almost invisible, almost nothing at all. And yet, for all the stillness she tried to keep inside herself, her heart was not made of stone. It was flesh, and it felt. That evening, the cold was sharper than usual, each breath blooming in front of her lips in a small white cloud. The air scented faintly of snow, though no flakes had yet fallen. Winter frost had painted the rooftops in silver, and the cobblestones glittered faintly in the lantern light. The packlands buzzed with a rare, electric energy, the kind that came only with nights like this, when something extraordinary might happen. Lyria kept to the edges of the bustle, watching as women in silk and velvet swept past in gowns that caught the light with every movement, their laughter tinkling like glass bells. Men in pressed coats and polished boots gathered in tight circles, voices low speaking of alliances, rivalries, and the Alpha King. Even the air seemed to hum with anticipation. Every few moments, a deep drumbeat rolled through the square, steady and slow, a pulse that seemed to settle into her very bones. Lanterns hung from poles, casting soft golden halos against the dark sky, their flames swaying in the light wind. Somewhere in the distance, a pack singer's voice rose in a haunting melody, weaving through the cold like a ribbon of warmth. This was the night of the choosing ceremony, the one night each decade when the Alpha King might name his Luna, and though most believed they already knew the names of the likely candidates, there was still room for speculation, gossip, and dreams. Lyria had no place in those dreams. She was not adorned in silks or jewels. Her simple dress was mended in 3 places along the hem. Nay, and the wool shawl around her shoulders was more practical than beautiful. No one looked at her twice. and if they did, it was only to step around her without apology. Still, she felt the beat of the drums in her chest and the strange, unshakable quickening in her pulse, as if her body knew something her mind did not. She told herself it was nothing, that it was only the excitement in the air, the way everyone's movements seemed sharper, faster, more alive on nights like this. But as she lingered near the fringe of the gathering, half hidden by the shadows of a merchant's stall, her eyes kept straying toward the grand gates of the hall, waiting without meaning to, though she could not have said for what. The cold bit at her fingers, the frost glistened like stardust on the edges of the banners, and the drums called again. Low, slow, insistent, a sound that made her spine straighten and her breath catch in her throat. The deep toll of the drum faded into the air, replaced by an uneasy hush that spread through the crowd like a ripple across still water. And it was then that Lyria realized the reason for the sudden change. The great gates of the hall had swung open. From within, a figure emerged, and though she had never seen him before, she knew without needing to be told that this was the Alpha King. Rumours of him had long found their way even to the lowliest corners of the servant quarters, whispered in the quiet hours before dawn, or traded between tired hands scrubbing stone floors. They said his name was Kaelith, that he had led warriors into battles where the snow ran red, and returned each time without so much as a falter in his stride. They said his command over the pack was not merely a matter of title, but of something deeper, a force that made wolves bow their heads without thinking, that made men abandon doubts before they could speak them aloud. Some spoke of his mercy, but more told of his ruthlessness, of the way his gaze could strip a soul bare until there was nothing left to hide. Now, as he stepped into the square, the crowd seemed to know and so, instinctively to shift aside, creating a path without any spoken order. His height alone was striking, a towering presence that seemed to take up more space than his frame could account for. But it was the way he carried himself that stilled the air. Broad shoulders squared beneath a dark, heavy cloak, the fur at its collar dusted with frost, every movement deliberate, unhurried, yet threaded with the quiet promise of power. The lamplight caught on the strands of his dark hair, framing a face carved in sharp lines, the kind that spoke of both nobility and danger. His eyes, when they swept over the crowd, were not the restless kind that darted from face to face. They lingered, heavy, assessing, as though each person before him was a question that required an answer. The murmurs that followed him were hushed, barely more than breaths. The weight of his presence seemed to press the sound from the air itself. Lyria, standing where shadow met lantern glow, felt her breath catch without permission. She told herself she was only looking because everyone else was. But when his gaze moved toward her side of the square, it felt less like chance and more like inevitability. She had thought, if such a moment ever came, she would look away quickly, but when his eyes met hers, she could not move. It was only a heartbeat, maybe less. Yet in that space she felt something coil tight in her chest, a pressure that was not fear, but something she could not name. His stare was not a passing glance. It was a deliberate pause, the kind that suggested he had seen her fully, not as a servant or an omega, but as a being in her own right. Then, just as suddenly, his attention shifted, moving past her as though the moment had never happened, leaving her with the echo of it in her pulse. Around her, the crowd resumed its rustle, the sounds of movement and breath filling the air again. But to Lyria, it felt as though the space between that meeting of eyes and now stretched far longer than it truly had. She lowered her gaze, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only way to break. the strange weight that lingered in the air around her. Somewhere behind her, a woman whispered his name, the syllables drawn out like a prayer, and Lyria realized her hands were curled into fists inside her shawl. Though she could not have said why, the hum of the crowd was pierced by the sudden shift in movement, as a tall figure in crimson silk detached herself from a small circle of well-dressed pack members. Celine's presence drew eyes without effort. Her gown caught the light like a living flame, and the measured sway of her stride spoke of someone well aware of her own beauty. The faint glint in her gaze was sharp enough to cut, and it fixed on Lyria with the precision of a blade finding its target. There was a curl to her lips that might have passed for warmth at a distance, but up close, it was the brittle sort of smile that cracked under scrutiny. She closed the space between them with unhurried steps, her perfume, a heady blend of roses and something darker, seeping into the air around them. Leaning slightly forward, her words were pitched low enough that only Lyria could hear, though the poison in them needed no volume to be felt. "Don't get ideas, little mute," she breathed, her tone wrapping the insult in feigned concern. "The Alpha King doesn't waste his time on charity." The syllables dripped with condescension, each one meant to settle in Lyria's chest like a stone. Behind her, a ripple of laughter broke from the cluster of women who had been watching, their eyes flicking between Celine and Lyria as though this was entertainment arranged for their benefit. The sound was light, practiced, but its edge was honed to wound. Lyria kept her gaze lowered, the tips of her lashes catching the glow from the lanterns, the faintest tightening of her jaw the only sign she had heard. Heat rose beneath her skin, not from the winter air, but from the sting of humiliate. Iron that prickled across every nerve. The temptation to reply flared briefly before she crushed it. Words she had learned often gave people more to use against you. Instead, she focused on the patterned weave of her shawl, the small rhythm of her fingers pressing into it, as though grounding herself in that texture could hold her steady. Around them, the music swelled again, strings and drums weaving together in a song that rose above the low roar of voices. The sharp scent of spiced wine drifted through the air from the tables near the edge of the square, mingling with the richer, earthier aroma of pine smoke that curled upward from the braziers. Somewhere, a glass clinked against another. A burst of laughter erupted far from her, and for a moment it seemed the world might simply swallow the moment and carry it away. But when she lifted her head, slowly, as though pulled by some unseen thread, she found that Kaelin's gaze was on her once more. This time it did not glance past, did not flicker away after a heartbeat. It lingered, steady, almost searching, the kind of look that held weight and asked questions without words. She could not have said how long the moment lasted. It stretched and bent, thinning the noise around her until there was nothing but the silent exchange between them. The laughter at her back dimmed, the music blurred, the scents in the air receded, and there was only the burn of his eyes, holding hers as though nothing else in the square existed. The space between them, once thick with distance and the shifting bodies of the crowd, began to narrow in a way that felt both inevitable and impossible all at once. The Alpha King moved through the throng without haste, yet the people around him seemed to melt aside instinctively, as though some unspoken command compelled them to part. His steps were deliberate, measured, and each one seemed to pull the air tighter until even the sounds of music and chatter felt muted, muffled beneath the weight of his presence. The rich folds of his dark cloak brushed against the edges of garments and lantern. Poles, but not a soul dared touch him. Lyria's pulse drummed in her ears, outpacing the steady rhythm of his approach, each beat a warning and a summons all at once. When he stopped before her, the world seemed to pause. The flicker of the lantern flames slowed. The movement of the crowd blurred at the edges of her vision. He was taller up close than she had realized from a distance, his shadow spilling over her and pooling at her feet. His gaze did not waver, sharp and certain, and when his voice came, it cut through the thick air with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "You are Lyria," he said, the words spoken not as inquiry, but as truth already known. It was a tone that left no space for denial or evasion, a statement that seemed to see past her skin, past her silence, to something deeper. She managed a small nod, the motion feeling heavier than it should, as if the act of acknowledging his words bound her to them in some unseen way. His eyes held hers a moment longer, their weight both unsettling and oddly steadying, before he spoke again. "Be ready," he said, and the way the words settled in the space between them was like the toll of a distant bell, low, resonant, and carrying more meaning than the sound itself revealed. No explanation followed, no gesture to hint at what readiness might entail, and before she could shape a thought to question him, he was already stepping back. The press of the crowd swallowed his retreating form, figures shifting to close the space he had cut through, the lantern light catching briefly on the edge of his cloak before it vanished entirely from view. The air seemed thinner without him in it, as though she had been holding her breath and now could not quite remember how to draw it in again. The words he had left her with echoed in her mind, quiet but insistent. Ready, ready, ready. Each repetition raising a dozen questions. She could not answer. Ready for what? For a command? For danger? For some change she could not yet see? Her fingers curled into the fabric of her shawl, grounding herself in the weave, but the thread of uncertainty pulled tighter. Around her, the square's sounds slowly returned, the swell of the music, the clink of glasses, the murmur of voices rising and falling in familiar patterns. Yet none of it seemed to reach her fully, as though she now stood slightly apart from it all, marked in some invisible way by the brief exchange. She tried to glance casually toward the direction he had gone, but the crowd was a shifting wall of faces and shoulders, none of them his. The warmth of the braziers reached her in faint waves, but the place where he had stood still felt cooler, as if a fragment of winter had lingered there. She smoothed the edge of her sleeve, steadying her hands, though the weight of his words remained, an unseen tether pulling at the edges of her thoughts. Whatever he had meant, it had not been idle. That much she knew with certainty, though certainty about anything else felt further away than ever. The noise of the square had dulled to a distant hum, as though the frost-tinged garden existed in a world just a fraction removed from the one she had left behind. Lyria stood near the edge of the lantern light, the pale glow spilling across brittle branches that trembled faintly in the cold breeze. Her breath misted in soft clouds, each exhale vanishing into the dark. The ground beneath her boots crunched faintly when she shifted her weight, the gravel path frozen solid by the night's chill. She had come here to be unseen for a moment, to breathe without the press of eyes on her, but the quiet was broken by a sound that drew her still, the measured rhythm of footsteps on the path, steady and unhurried, yet deliberate in their approach. From the shadows between and two frost-laced hedges, Kaelith emerged, the dark fabric of his cloak seeming to absorb the light before it could reach him. His gaze found her at once, and though the weight of it was as certain as it had been in the square, there was a softness in his voice when he spoke, one that felt strange against the image of the man she had heard in stories. "I thought you'd be hiding by now," he said, the faintest trace of something almost like amusement flickering at the corner of his mouth. She did not answer, though she held his gaze longer than she thought she could. The stillness between them seemed to deepen, and he stepped closer, his eyes tracing the faint pale line that curved along the side of her neck. It was an old mark, almost invisible unless the light struck just so, but his attention fixed on it with sharp recognition. "I've seen that mark before," he murmured, not to himself exactly, but in a tone that suggested the thought was as much memory as observation. The air seemed to press closer, the frost on the leaves around them catching glints of light like a scattering of stars. "It means you're stronger than they think," he continued, his voice low, certain, and devoid of the mockery she was used to hearing from others. The words landed in a place within her she had long kept guarded, and though her lips parted, no answer formed before the moment fractured. From the far side of the garden came the sharp, clear ring of Celine's voice, each syllable carrying the crisp edge of command and disdain. "Your Majesty!" she called, the title dressed in sweetness that barely masked the steel beneath. "You shouldn't be wasting your time here." The interruption sliced through the fragile quiet, scattering it like brittle frost underfoot. The moment Celine's voice faded into the night, the muffled strains of music from the square swelled once more, weaving through the frosted air like a lure back into the warmth and light. Lyria returned to the main hall, the flicker of candles and the glow of lanterns painting the faces of the gathered pack in gold and shadow. Yet, beneath the polished laughter and the rhythmic beat of drums, she could feel it. The shift in the air, the way eyes turned toward her just long enough to feed curiosity before sliding away in feigned indifference. It was in the curve of hushed mouths, in the quick sidelong glances, in the subtle tightening of shoulders as she passed. The whispers had already begun their crawl through the crowd, slick and quick. A living thing carried on eager tongues. The silent Omega had dared to stand in the Alpha King's shadow, dared to catch his attention, dared to exchange something, even if it had been nothing more than a glance, a nod, a wordless acknowledgement. By the time she reached the long banquet table, its polished surface heavy with platters of roasted meat and bowls of glistening fruit, Celine was already waiting, her crimson silk catching the light like a smear of fresh blood. She stepped into Lyria's path with the ease of someone accustomed to taking up more space than she was given, her painted lips curling into a smile that promised nothing kind. Leaning in so no one else could hear, Celine's voice slid between them like the edge of a blade. "If you embarrass our pack tonight," she said, each syllable measured and cool, "you'll regret it." The words sank into Lyria's skin as surely as frost seeps into bone. But before she could step away, Celine's hand tilted the goblet she held. The deep red wine spilled in a sudden, deliberate arc, splashing across the pale fabric of Lyria's gown. The cold liquid clung, sinking into the cloth until it bloomed like an ugly wound, the sharp scent of fermented grapes rising in the warm air. For a heartbeat, silence wrapped around them, tight and unyielding, and then the collective gasp broke it apart, sharp and breathless. Heads turned, a few hands lifted to cover mouths. The flicker of candlelight caught in the wide eyes of those watching, their expressions shifting between shock, discomfort, and a quiet, hungry delight at the unfolding spectacle. Lyria's hands hovered uselessly over the stain, her throat tight though, no sound escaped. She searched the crowd, for a dark cloak, for a pair of eyes she had only just begun to recognize in the throng. But Kaelin was nowhere. His absence yawned in her chest like a hollow space, the noise of the hall pressing in all the heavier for it. Somewhere beyond the bodies and the light and the music, he might have been engaged in some unseen duty, or perhaps he had already turned his attention elsewhere entirely. Either way, here, now, she stood alone beneath the weight of Celine's triumph, the heat of humiliation burning beneath the cold, wet fabric clinging to her skin. The sound came like the crack of a whip through the charged air, a single word, cut clean and sharp, carrying with it a command that left no space for argument. "Enough!" The chatter, the muttered commentary, even the music seemed to stumble and die in its wake, the silence that followed heavy and immediate. All eyes turned as the crowd parted in ripples, the movement instinctive, almost fearful. And there he was, Kaelith, the Alpha King, stepping forward with a deliberate, unhurried pace that somehow made his presence all the more dominating. The golden light from the chandeliers slid across the planes of his face, catching in the hard gleam of his eyes, which blazed with a heat that could have set the room aflame. His gaze locked on Selene first, the weight of it enough to make her spine stiffen and her painted smile falter, though she tried to hold it a moment longer. The line of his jaw tightened, as though reining in something dangerous, something that might yet spill over if provoked. Then, without breaking stride, he moved to Lyria's side, the press of the crowd melting away in his wake, as if none dared block his path. The faint scent of frost and pine clung to him, a sharp contrast to the warm wine smell soaking her gown. When he stopped beside her, his voice was no longer the restrained murmur she had heard in the garden. It was a declaration, deep and resonant, meant for every ear present. "She is mine." The words fell into the stillness like stones into water, sending visible ripples through the assembly. Gasps rose here and there, some sharp with shock, others edged with disbelief. But Kaelith wasn't finished. His shoulders squared and his tone deepened further, carrying an unshakable finality. "From this moment," he said, the pause deliberate, his eyes flicking once toward Lyria, with something almost protective before returning to the crowd. "Lyria is my chosen Luna." The effect was immediate. Conversations died before they could begin. Glances exchanged like the shuffle of cards in uncertain hands. Selene's confidence, that easy cutting poise she wore like armour, shattered visibly. The red silk of her gown seemed to dim under the weight of the stares now turned on her, her chin dipping in a reflex she couldn't quite suppress. Somewhere in the crowd a goblet was set down too hard, the faint ring of metal on wood echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Kaelin's hand rested lightly at Lyria's back, not pressing, not claiming in force, but there, steady, a line of heat through the cold fabric clinging to her. His presence beside her was enough to change the very shape of the space she occupied, enough to make those who had stared in derision moments ago now drop their gazes entirely. The moment held, unbroken, a fragile, shimmering thing balanced on the edge of his authority, and for the first time since the night began, Lyria felt the air move in her lungs without strain. Later, after the murmurs of the hall had faded into the distance and the warmth of torchlight was replaced by the cool embrace of night, the Alpha's private courtyard lay in serene contrast to the tension of earlier. Moonlight spilled over the high stone wall, like silver water, catching on the frost-laced ivy that clung stubbornly to the ancient masonry, and painting the flagstones in pale, shimmering patterns. The air here was different, quieter, sharper, scented with pine, and the faint trace of wood smoke drifting from somewhere beyond. Lyria stood near the edge of the central fountain, the gentle trickle of water a soft counterpoint to the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Across from her, Kaelin's form seemed almost carved from the shadows themselves, broad shoulders catching stray beams of moonlight, his presence filling the space without overwhelming it. "You'll be safe now," he said, and though the words were firm, there was an undertone in his voice that spoke less of finality and more of a promise he intended to keep at any cost. His eyes, however, betrayed the weight of unspoken thought. They flicked toward the dark line of forest beyond the courtyard walls, where the black silhouettes of pines swayed gently under the pull of the wind. For a moment she followed his gaze, her own eyes adjusting to the depth of the shadows beyond the gate. And there, between the trees, faint, almost imperceptible movement caught the edge of her vision. The shapes were too far to define, but the sense of being watched tightened the air between them. Kaelin's jaw shifted slightly, the smallest sign that he too had noticed. "Still," he murmured, his voice low enough that it might have been meant only for himself. "Peace never lasts long in the Silverfang lands." The words lingered between them like mist, their meaning heavy with the kind of truth one feels rather than simply hears. Lyria's fingers curled slightly at her sides, not from fear, but from the strange awareness that whatever had unfolded tonight was only the beginning of something larger, something waiting just beyond the veil of the present. The courtyard's stillness seemed to amplify that thought, the quiet no longer peaceful but expectant, each creak of a branch in the distance, and each rustle of wind through the ivy hinting at a story yet to come. Len's eyes returned to hers then, holding them as though to anchor her in this moment before the tide shifted again. There was no smile, no softening in his features, only the steady presence of someone who understood the weight of his own warning. Above them, the moon rode high, framed by drifting clouds, its cold light washing over stone, water, and the two figures who stood alone against the night. Somewhere far off, a wolf's call rose and fell, the sound threading through the air like a signal or a challenge, and Lyria felt the echo of it deep in her chest. Neither of them moved for a long moment, as if both knew that when they did, the fragile boundary holding the night's calm together might shatter. And in that stillness, with the frost glinting at their feet, and the forest watching from the dark, the truth of his words settled into her bones, the kind of truth that did not fade with dawn,